In 1 Kings 17, we find the prophet Elijah in a desperate situation, but not nearly as desperate as the widow he's about to encounter. The land is suffering from a severe drought. No rain, no crops, no food. People are starving, and it seems like death is knocking on every door. But in the midst of this, God gives Elijah an unexpected command.
Go to Zarephath. I have commanded a widow there to supply you with food.
Now wait a minute, a widow? In that time, widows were some of the most vulnerable members of society. They had no means of support. And this wasn't just any widow. She lived in Zarephath, a town in the heart of Baal-worshipping territory. If you were looking for resources, this would be the last place you'd go. But God had a plan, as he always does. When Elijah arrives, he finds the widow gathering sticks, and he asks her for a drink of water. As she turns to get it, he makes another request. Bring me a piece of bread as well. Her response is heartbreaking. As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. This widow wasn't just running low, she was on her last meal. Can you picture the desperation in her eyes? She was preparing for the end. But Elijah responds with a word that only a man of God could deliver in such a moment. Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. Then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. Now think about this. Elijah is asking this widow to trust him, and more importantly, to trust God with the last of what she has. She's staring at her final resources, but Elijah is asking her to put God first, even in her scarcity. This is not just an act of generosity, this is an act of faith. And what does she do? She obeys. She takes that little bit of flour and oil, makes bread, and gives it to Elijah first. Then she makes something for herself and her son. And just as God promised, the flour and oil never run out. Every time she reaches into that jar and pours from that jug, there's just enough for another meal. Day after day, in the middle of a famine, God sustains her household through what seemed like nothing. And this isn't the only time God multiplied what seemed like too little. If you fast forward to 2 Kings 4, you find another widow, this time with the prophet Elisha. She's in a different kind of crisis. Her husband has died and she's drowning in debt. Her creditors are threatening to take her sons as slaves. She's desperate, with nothing but a small jar of oil to her name. Elisha tells her to gather as many empty jars as she can find and start pouring oil into them. Now, you might think that little bit of oil wouldn't amount to much, but as she pours, the oil keeps flowing, filling jar after jar until every vessel she collected is full. God took what little she had and multiplied it beyond her wildest expectations, just as he did for the widow of Zarephath. Do you see the pattern here? Whether it's Elijah or Elisha, whether it's flour or oil, God steps into these desperate situations where there's nothing left, and he multiplies what little remains. He turns scarcity into abundance, but only when we trust him with the little we have. This story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, alongside Elisha and the widow's oil, reminds us of a profound truth. God doesn't need abundance to perform a miracle. He can take what seems insignificant and multiply it beyond what we could ever imagine. But it requires faith. It requires obedience. It requires putting God first, even when it feels like you're down to your last drop. So what's the lesson? God is not limited by what you see in front of you. He's not constrained by the size of your paycheck, the amount of food in your cupboard, or the lack of resources in your life. What he's looking for is obedience, faith, and the willingness to trust him, even when it looks like you're down to nothing. The question is, are you willing to trust him with the little you have, knowing he can turn it into more than enough? Thank you for watching. We hope you learned something new today. God bless you. Amen.